Hello and welcome from Glasgow to this session on innovative finance of clean energy in emerging markets. My name is Antonia Gavel and I head the climate work at the World Economic Forum, and it's my pleasure to join you with an amazing set of panelists today to really discuss and dig into this important topic here on Finance Day at COP26. I'd just first like to thank Hitachi Energy for hosting the session with us, as well as the Swedish Pavilion here where we're hosting this discussion as well. So thank you very much for this collaboration and partnership. Just to set the scene briefly for why this is such an important issue, of course here in Glasgow we are discussing the importance of keeping the world on track for no more than a 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures. In order to do this, of course, we need countries to ratchet up their commitments in the context of climate mitigation. But in order to do that, we need to mobilize an incredible amount of finance, in particular in emerging markets. This is the only way that we will achieve this objective, as well as ensuring that people in these economies can thrive and have access to energy and see their economies grow. In particular, the forum at the World Economic Forum, in collaboration with the IEA and the World Bank in June, we issued a report which gave us, I think, some stark data to really look at the scale of the challenge that we have in front of us. What it says that we need to increase by 7-fold the scale of investment in clean energy in emerging markets by 2030. The challenge that we have is that the cost of capital in these markets is also 7 times higher. And I think that's really the context of this conversation. How are we going to close this gap, and how are we going to bring down the cost of capital in order to do that? So what we need to see is current investments in clean energy increase from about 150 billion today to over $1 trillion. This is enormous. So let us not kind of downplay the enormity of the challenge that we have, but of course the incredible opportunity that it presents and the positive innovation that we can bring to this discussion, which is what our panelists today will really talk to us about. So a lot of this work, of course, is founded in a collaboration with many institutions, and I think that's key, is that to achieve this we need an incredible amount of collaboration. And at the World Economic Forum, we host an initiative called Mobilizing Finance for Clean Energy, specifically in emerging markets. And we hope that these conversations can really help inspire, advance, and drive some of those efforts. So for us to really advance this conversation, as I said, we have an incredible panel with us here today. One, to look at how are we going to tackle this challenge? What are some of the examples, I think, that give us a light of positive opportunity in this space? And thirdly, how are we going to scale? How do we scale those opportunities that we see emerging today? So we have with us Arifin Tasfir, the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources of Indonesia, Anna Karin Yatko, Director General of the Swedish Export Credit Agency, and of course Claudio Facchin, the CEO of Hitachi Energy. So welcome to you all into this important discussion. So let me start with you, Claudio, if that's okay. Of course, Hitachi is incredibly committed to investing in clean energy solutions, in particular in emerging markets. I laid out some of the statistics and the challenges that we have in front of us, and what I'd love for you just to kind of kick us off with is not a negative note of these are all the challenges that we have in front of us, but really just framing what are some of the obstacles that we need to collectively overcome in order to close that financing gap.
Thank you, and great to be here. So, to start with, maybe on the bigger picture, there is no doubt, and you mentioned 7 times what we've been doing in the past, and of course, I don't think that we have the solutions on looking backwards on what we have done so far. We have to allow ourselves to innovate going forward, and when I mean innovate, of course, certainly from a technology standpoint, we need to continue to drive innovation, to drive the cost down, so that this financing would find more attractive places to go, but at the same time innovating in terms of business models, in terms of how do we collaborate across all the stakeholders to make this equation work. And when you look at it from a technology standpoint, first of all, I think it's important for the audience to understand that the technology is not the bottleneck today, it's not the roadblock. Of course, we as technology provider, we continue to innovate, we continue to challenge ourselves in order to make sure that we have the right competitive technology out there. What we need to work on in order to scale this up is find the operating collaborative models that allow us to deploy at scale that technology. And when it comes to particular emerging markets, emerging economies, there are, and Indonesia, if I may, is one of the clear examples where within that ecosystem there is room to deploy all the technologies that are already today available for instance, providing access to electricity, affordability as well in remote islands in terms of microgrids, energy storage, using renewables rather than diesel generation, for instance. On the other end, Indonesia has also a need to create a stronger backbone, to interconnect the mainland and to, as it was already communicated, to come gradually out of coal. We need to relocate the resources from a renewable standpoint and therefore redesign the overall grid infrastructure. Now, if you look at it from attractiveness in terms of investment, I would, of course, I do see the challenge in terms of higher risk, in terms of returns, in terms of uncertainties created in this particular environment. But when you look at the overall energy transition, and if you look at what returns we can get by investing in those emerging markets, we could create learnings and fast-track learnings by deploying that technology with the right financial models that then can be also leveraged as a learning in mature markets. And we've seen some of those cases as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, sort of a few points there. One is the opportunity, as you say, there in many markets, energy demand, of course, is increasing part and parcel with economic progress. So there's an incredible opportunity to use that as a space for innovation as well. And we are seeing, and I think we'll discuss this, we are seeing very clear kind of drawing down of cost of a number of these technologies. And so it's not necessarily a case of it always costing more. I think the cost of capital, though, in certain instances is still part of the challenge. So the technology solutions, as you say, are available in certain contexts. We need to scale the deployment of those solutions in markets globally. And I think, and at scale, when we talk about the sort of volume of finance is quite significant. So I think the note about technology availability is certainly critical, and we'll come back to that with a few examples as well. I mean, I think Claudio pointed to Indonesia, of course, as an example. And Minister, you have set incredibly bold targets and ambitions on this agenda in Indonesia. And you yourselves have estimated that you need about 5 billion in investment into renewables annually until 2025 for you to meet your target of reaching 23% renewable in the national renewables in the national energy mix. So I would love to hear from you how you see partnership and investment helping you achieve this incredible objective.
Thank you, Antonio. Indonesia, as you may know, that we are using fossil energy for quite long because we have the source of energy in our country. We are blessed with the source of energy. And then recently we signed the Paris Agreement that we agreed to reduce the emission. So we set up such kind of program, strategy, in order how to bring more renewable come into our energy mix. In our target by 2025, we have to put 23% of renewable in our system. So recently, we are using only 11%. So we have to bring about 10 to 12 gigawatt renewable into our system. And of course, this will require such kind of investment, because not only for the energy generator itself, but we also have to consider about the infrastructures. Yeah, location of the renewable source, spread it all over. We are an archipelagic country. We are blessed. We have big potential of solar energy, hydro, geothermal, wind, even the tidal and undercurrent. So we thought that by getting the support of this amount of capital, we may achieve. But we are not rely on the international support itself. Government also allocates such kind of budget in order to realize the thing. But again, I think all the countries right now aiming to reduce the emission, willing to bring clean and renewable energy in all systems. So this is such kind of a good vision. And then it will make an easy collaboration among the nations to support each other.
No, thank you, Minister. And could you talked to, of course, the role of international finance, the investments that are happening at the domestic level. How do you see that collaboration with the international private finance community in coming in to really support the objectives that you outlined of achieving that 5 billion in investment?
Well, three-party collaboration will be essential. Government, private, and international financial institution to support all the things, because we need a lot of allocation of budget, yeah, to realize our target, especially to reach the net zero emission after 2050. Our aim is to reach by 2060. Yeah? But we have to calculate, at least we need $250 billion in order to bring renewable to come in, and then to phase out our fossil power plant gradually.
No, it is indeed that twofold challenge. One is, as you say, mobilize money into renewable energy, into broader energy mix to decarbonize, but also supporting the divestment and transition of some of the current infrastructure that is there, which is a whole other element of the financing conversation as well. And we'll come back to that, I think, with some examples. If I can turn to you, Anna-Karin, in Sweden and with the Export Credit Agency, there are some interesting innovative mechanisms that are starting to emerge and have been playing in the market for some time. I think first the question that we would love to just ask you to help us understand is really, what is the role of export credit agencies as one of the players, as the Minister just said, in this partnership between different financing components really that we need to bring together?
Right. Let me start by maybe sticking my neck out somewhat by saying you've just stated that technology isn't the problem. Well, I don't think financing is either, actually, so that should be good news for the three of us on this panel. First of all, export credit agencies as such, what we effectively do is we assume the risk of commercial lending. And in our case, we've been doing this for more than 90 years. And I believe Hitachi has been a client of ours, albeit under a slightly different name, for almost 90 years. So effectively, I mean, there is massive investment needed. Many countries need investing for a long time and very large volumes. And ECA financing is the type of financing that is really tailor-made to a large extent for those type of needs. First of all, you may not know, and one of the themes today has been, and yesterday, how do you turn billions to trillions? Well, effectively, the ECA market is roughly $700 billion every year. So there's plenty of financing to be had as such. All my ECA colleagues, none of them lack capacity. We have 50 billion euros capacity on an annual basis. So obviously we have great scope. And I mean, ECA financing is roughly comparable to the aid flows. So many developing countries, rightly so, are clearly advocating there is a need for more aid to cover some of these investments. But ECA financing is really also very important. And one of the many reasons why ECA financing is interesting is that it serves as a catalyst often for other financing, sometimes up to 5 times the amount that we generate. And the type of structure we often tend to use when it comes to ECA financing is that we have very long tenors. We can assume risk, large risk, and especially when it comes to sovereign risk, we realize that it's effectively cooperation for many years between many parties. And that is, I think, a theme possibly of our panel here today. How do we really ensure that that cooperation happens? Because you don't easily finance large projects that have got very long-term tenor without cooperation. And one of the many issues here is that, as you said, technology per se is not the challenge. However, there is a need to ensure that developing markets have access to the latest technology. And that's where ECA financing can actually ensure that the long-term cost of buying the latest technology is actually achievable, rather than only focusing on buying the cheapest technology, which is very short-term, because we are trying to serve, the global long-term energy supply. So I think all in all, this type of financing has got plenty of scope when it comes to financing energy long-term in all developing markets.
No, thank you. I mean, as you say at the top, the financing is available. There is plenty of financing available in the system. How do we create the frameworks and then the mechanisms to channel the finance to the right place and to the right place and to the right solutions, I think, is critical. Maybe just as a follow-up for you, I mean, in the way that you talk about the credit agency and the work and the availability of finance, it's framed in a sense as though it's not being leveraged enough. So I would just love to hear from you, what is it that is perhaps, an action, new partnerships to help leverage this as a source of capital alongside others more?
I think firstly, it's the realization that because this is long-term, it requires long-term cooperation. All these projects have a number of sustainability risks, and you really need to monitor them, not only at the time when you are beginning a discussion, but you need to really be there for a long time. And that's why I think that we may come back to an example or two later, but effectively, when you get those many parties, also as the minister outlined, we're talking governments, we're talking DFIs, we're talking banks, we're clearly talking exporters, highly skilled companies, and also ECA. But I think the other side of that coin is, yes, we can all do better, we need to cooperate more, we need to be more long-term, and that's why we're here today. But the other side of the coin is that we need to stop dragging our feet when it comes to really changing rules and regulations for this type of finance. It's clear that we have not really started running when it comes to ensuring that renewable finance, for example, can achieve better terms and conditions. And all terms and conditions in the financial sector are rules-based. So in a way, this is really one of those key factors that if we are to ensure this renewable energy transition, we need to actually change some of the rules of the regulations as well.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you and ask you to give me some examples of which rules and regulations need to be changed, but give you a minute on that one. Maybe, Minister, if I could come back to you on this as well. So, of course, we are talking about investing in emerging markets, and there's various dimensions to that. Of course, there is the dimensions related to the investment itself. So how can we ensure that the context is favorable for renewable energy investments from a policy perspective and a regulatory perspective in Indonesia, of course. But also, what are some of the examples of efforts that you're driving in order to do that? When we think again about these different types of flows of finance that might come in internationally as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, in order to attract investor and finance support to our country, we prepare regulation. Recently, we are preparing our government regulation regarding the tariff for the renewables. This tariff, we are sure, will be attractive for investors to come. I'm happy to listen from my boss here. That they can offer such kind of competitive cost of capital and also long tenure. This is a kind of things that we need in order to drive more investment and then how to realize faster the renewable energy to be used. So we also adopting new innovation, new technology in order to get more efficient cost for the renewable. As mentioned by Claudio before, that after the merge of the ABB and Hitachi, so the company can bring more attractive offer to the clients, of course. And in this case, ABB has been long relation with Indonesia, supporting our infrastructure for electricity. So this is what we expect. Regulation, and then also such of incentive, like more ease for the taxation, something like that we are preparing.
Super. And I think it is important, you talk about partnership, the role of partnership between, of course, the government in setting the right policies and in certain cases incentives has proven absolutely critical to draw down the cost of some of these technologies and solutions. We saw this over a decade ago with solar, wind, and the costs came down faster than anybody, I think, anticipated. But those sort of policies and incentives are a critical part of this puzzle. But of course, adapting those as the energy cost does come down to create that market economy framework as well. Maybe Claudio, if I could turn back to you, I think you've been kind of framing that context of technology availability. But technology in the right context, in the right market, and for the right use, I think is key here as well. So would just love to sort of, take this conversation a step further. So as you look at, partnership with Indonesia and other markets, what are you really looking for in terms of that framework in order to be able to kind of scale investments in the market? And what do you see as sort of that potential to start to bring some of these technology solution costs down at scale as well? What's needed from your side?
Yeah, I would look at a couple of concrete examples there where technology has made tremendous steps in the last decade, and that's the digital part, digitalization of critical infrastructure such grids. In the past, we used to introduce technology over a decade and test it over the next decade and then put it into operation. And of course, with digitalization, all that cycle has been reduced. Looking at how we could attract financing to invest in digitalization, because if you just look at the CapEx part, if you just look at the build aspect, you will not be able to incentivize But there is no doubt that with digitalization, creating smarter grids, and Indonesia has put a concrete initiative in that area to look at how much we would save in terms of less disruptions, in terms of better efficiency, in terms of demand response, looking at I generate what I need and not curtail, for instance, renewables going forward. So all of that needs a different way of assessing the returns. It needs evaluating the life cycle cost of that investment. So CapEx would be one, but then also OpEx would be another important element to take into account. And that goes the same for larger scale interconnections, as well as I mentioned before, edge technology in the grids and storage. What I believe it's really essential that we all see the opportunity of accelerating this energy transition, that we all understand that there is no way that we can get there globally if we do not make this happen in emerging economies.
No, absolutely. And I think let us maybe dive into a couple of specific examples. I think we of course discuss these issues at a global scale, and in this case, in the context of emerging markets. Emerging markets, of course, themselves are incredibly diverse in terms of the types of approaches and solutions, not only in terms of financing, but what actually is appropriate in the context of the market and where it's at. I mean, coming back to you, Anna Karin, you have some examples, I think, to share with us around how your work has helped to kind of bring further solutions into some of the emerging markets through using some of these innovative financing mechanisms that you discussed. So maybe if you could share some of those examples so that we can bring some specific flavor to the conversation as well.
Yes, I think we have quite a recent and very successful example. Let me start by just ensuring that we're all in Angola now. An African country with 30 million inhabitants, seventh largest country in Africa, who is clearly very reliant on fossil fuels for producing electricity. Young population need more electricity. And what we have done together with a number of different parties, I'll come back to those in a minute, is that we have actually financed the biggest solar energy project in sub-Saharan Africa, which is producing 370 megawatts on an annual basis. It has 7 different facilities, and these type of projects in that type of market, you would normally assume, yes, this will take many, many, many years. And in fact, this solar park is going to be completed 2022. So I think it's a very good example of the technology transfer that Hitachi has been contributing to. But our part has really been to ensure that there is financing. And this is the financing package we have been part of, which is not the entire package because this requires large volume, is about 560 million euros. We have done this together within the Swedish export credit system, which also incorporates Swedish Export Credit Corporation. So we guarantee, and then we have the bank part. On top of that, there is a commercial bank, ING, that has set up the facility. You need commercial banks. We also have our Korean colleagues that have reinsured some of the Korean deliveries, because you need a lot of techniques from a number of countries. Not only do we have some of the large Swedish corporates in this transaction, we've actually also set up more than 30 SMEs that have been delivering to the project from their specific technological niches, abilities. And we have also worked with the Development Bank of Southern Africa. So apart from, of course, the Angolan government. And I think it's these type of collaborative efforts that are needed, not only to ensure that this type of project happens, because of course it can be a challenging environment, but also really to safeguard financing and long-term financing. And I think one of the key factors when it comes to the success of this particular project is the fact that we have actually been able to raise this finance and therefore it's really happening. So we have been part of ensuring that even a country that is traditionally very reliant on fossil fuels has the ability to invest in solar energy. So that's really, I think it's a very positive example of the many opportunities, because I think the word here is opportunity, and I think you've already raised that, Claudio.
Claudio, jump in.
If I just make, in the past, to create the same generating capacity with traditional centralized fossil fuel technologies, it would take twice the amount of time. You would need roughly 10 years to get to operations, and in this case it's about half of the time in order to deploy renewable technology, also thanks to the fact that there is an ecosystem that is there ready to invest.
No, absolutely, and this point about, and you made this point, that the ecosystem of financial players actually that are playing a role in supporting these types of projects and investments, which can help make it accelerate, but also make sure that the different elements that are being covered are managed as well. No, I think that's an excellent example. Minister, maybe if I could come back to you. I mean, in the context of sort of the targets that you've set, of course, as you said, there's a number of incentives and regulations coming into place to be also able to support the attractiveness of some of these investments. Are there any kind of examples or areas that you'd like to highlight of how this is already working in Indonesia in order to help advance some of the renewable energy investments or other solutions to the transition?
Yeah, right now we run such a project like the solar energy project. In our 10 years plan for the electricity procurement, we put solar energy as our priority because we have quite numerous sources of that. And then we aim to use our surface water, I mean the floating solar panel. Yeah, then right now under construction, one unit is in the West Java, 145 megawatt, and it will come another package. So right now, some investor, they are more attractive. They are more. They have more intention to invest in renewable energy in Indonesia, especially for the solar energy, because the technology become improved, and then the cost also can be much competitive, and the time of the construction is also shortest. And Indonesia, we have many islands in the country that we have to fulfill the needs of the electricity to our people who live in there. So we also looking the recent developed technologies such as the tidal small scales in order to replace our diesel fossil fuels. So we have a discussion with the several technology companies in order to support our energy transition.
Oh, this is excellent. So I think one of the things that we have seen on here and on Finance Day is, of course, enormous commitment, as you say, from the finance community to make capital available, right? As we said, there's availability of capital. There are examples of projects and partnerships that are coming together in order to start to deploy this capital and help advance this energy transition. I think that the challenge, maybe for us to just take us into the next part of this discussion, is how do we do this quickly enough and at, I think, a scale that we haven't seen before, globally, of course, but also in this case, in the context of our conversation, in these emerging markets. And I think it's excellent to point to examples, but I think this is really where we need to start getting, let's say, increasingly creative. How do we scale at speed? How do we take these examples of partnerships and kind of increase them tenfold? while also starting to phase down some of the fossil solutions quickly that are currently forming, in certain cases, the bulk of the energy mix, while also obviously ensuring that all of the populations have access to power. So the question for me now is scale. What are we going to do to accelerate the pace of that investment and transition? So maybe, Claudio, if I could start with you just for your thoughts on that. How do you bring more solutions to market?
I think one good approach, and we've been working together jointly with the WEF on creating a system value framework that allows all the stakeholders to look at the respective building blocks, not only from a technology standpoint, not only from a financial return standpoint, but also, for instance, from a consumer standpoint. How do we make sure that the technology that we deploy with the right financing model has also a benefit to the consumers, to the users, to the people that the minister was mentioning? It's living in an island, and for the time being, the only way for them to get electricity is running diesel. Within that framework, there is then, of course, the need, once we have looked at the whole system, of making decisions, taking decisions on prioritizing, making decisions across, of course, all those options. What is the best way to get to decarbonize? Of course, getting there the fastest, but also not leaving anyone behind. So, and those decisions are the ones that usually, from a business standpoint, are sort of, we're used to make those. What we're not used to is as a society to make those decisions jointly with government, with financial institutions, with also society, so that we make everyone understand where the benefits are and when those benefits will come. It is also important to understand that the roadmap, while we all know where we stand in terms of energy mix in Indonesia, and now we also clearly know where Indonesia wants to be in terms of decarbonization in 2050. We have the same in many other countries. The roadmap to get there is different. And in order for us then to scale technology, to scale financing, we need to take that into account. We need to take into account what is the roadmap, how do we make sure that jointly we plan now for 2030, 2040 and 2050, keeping in mind that if we miss our targets for 2030, we're not going to be meeting our targets in 2050.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think this is the additional challenge, is how do we start investing today? Because if we don't invest today, we're not on track for 2030. Maybe, Claudio, just a follow-up question for you. You talked about how this requires a different type of collaboration. How is this approach, as you say, kind of not just looking at it from the private sector perspective, but requiring that partnership between the finance community, the sort of varying, let's say, stakeholders in the finance community and the government? How are you changing the way that you operate your business in order to actually collaborate in a very different way? And I think, again, I'd just like to press again on this scale question. How do we do this fast enough? What are you changing to do this type of deployment faster than you've ever had to do it before?
Yep. So, well, I think in our case, we have the benefit that we have built in the last 90 years, trust with all these stakeholders in Sweden to start with. And the example that was just made on Angola is a concrete example on how we looked at, okay, we can deploy technology to integrate renewables, but we need financing, we need other stakeholders that deliver the value chain, because we're only focusing on part of it. And I think building that trust across all the stakeholders is essential. Without that, we will keep on testing each other every time, project by project, one after the other, and there is no way we can scale that way. Now, it is clear also that scaling, as someone said, digital technologies is much easier, because once you have it designed, once you have the code, you can just distribute it through communication. and training on how to use it. Large-scale infrastructure requires more piloting, requires more testing, and also more testing on how that technology needs to be deployed. But I think we have an opportunity today, and I agree with you, that it's more the opportunity than the risk to align on how do we want to deploy those technologies across and taking the learnings that, for instance, we build starting from Sweden and replicate that. One very good example is this system value framework where Indonesia took it and made a very concrete plan on how to leverage all those building blocks and deliver on that technology. Now it's up to all of us to chip in and contribute.
No, absolutely. And Akrina, if I could turn to you, it's sort of basically the same question: is how do really scale, and how do we scale in a way that puts that sort of money on the ground much more quickly?
I mean, it's not only a question of scaling; it's a question of speeding up as well. So we have a twofold challenge, and I think, I mean, I agree with Claudia. We need partnership, we need trust, we need to be long term, we need to stick to the plan that's been made and really not lose sight of the fact that the clock is ticking the whole time. To be more specific when it comes to financing, I think what we need to do is to ensure that some of the straitjacket that we ourselves have chosen to wear when it comes to the OECD rules and regulations, we need to loosen this. We need to adapt rules and regulations when it comes to export finance to the reality and to the test of time, effectively. I mean, the fact that this is an agreement that's very important, but it's based on consensus, and unfortunately we just all need to sit up and realize that the clock is ticking, so we can really have the right incentives for renewable energy, renewable technology. And it's effectively a question of supply and demand. If we ensure that it's easier to finance the right type of technology, then obviously the supply of old fossil, etc., is not going to be relevant long term. So I think there is a part where rules and regulations really need to be modernized and rapidly in order to ensure not least financing for developing markets.
Could you, and I said I would come back to you on this, I would love for the audience also for you maybe just to unpack and give us a few examples of where are the, let's say, rules and regulations counterproductive? What are some specific roadblocks that you would point to that if taken away could help actually overcome?
I think once upon a time when our colleagues actually sat down and designed these rules and regulations, they worked. But I mean, why is it that if you want to finance, export finance wind, it's 18 years. Why not 25 as an example? It's a long-term investment, wind's free. Why is it that you have to have quite substantial advanced payments? I mean, obviously, yes, advanced payment is part of a credit analysis, but maybe to speed up and scale up, you need to be looking at exactly how big is the advance, just so you really start working on the plan rather than getting stuck, in the beginning. There are a number of technical details like payment plans and so on that are just outdated when it comes to the need for these type of investments.
No, and I think it's an important point is again, often we do talk about the scale of investment needed, the partnerships needed at a very macro level, but ultimately a lot of the devil is in the detail. It's actually looking at the specific mechanisms, the specific regulations, the specific kind of conditions that actually if we fix a lot of those details, suddenly we can unlock quite a lot of challenges that we see as well. Minister, maybe coming back to you, in order to sort of scale, sort of thinking about some of the projects that you mentioned and the discussions that you're having, what could help you move faster on achieving the targets that you've set?
Okay. We have the resources in the country. We have the demand. Talking about demand, we are not talking only Indonesia, because we are also having a good relation with our neighboring countries, like I said. So in order to accelerate the things in Indonesia itself, we should prepare such kind of regulations which is attractive for investor to come, and we guarantee that the investment will be returned in a good manner. So this is, I think, and then make more easier permit, something like that. So we hope, that the intention of the community of international financial will have a same vision, to support the realization of the transition energy to combat the climate change.
So this is a call and an invitation to the international finance community to come to the wonderful Indonesia and look at the possibilities of it.
Welcome, not Indonesia, also ASEAN.
And the ASEAN region. Of course, I've been there, I can attest. It's a wonderful place. Claudio.
If I add to that, we've been, as Minister mentioned, for decades working to support building a stronger infrastructure from an electricity standpoint. And I don't think that we had in the past a clear plan as we have today from their side. What we now need is to leverage that and also be open, also from our side as technology providers. What we did together with PLN in Indonesia is that we share our roadmap of technology and also ask them to come back to us and say, okay, this technology might work for us, this one you should look at some different perspectives. And once we have that, then of course it's also our task as technology providers to go back to the other stakeholders, to go back and, as she was saying, look at from a regulation standpoint. We can't use only the tools that we have in the old toolbox. We need to create new toolboxes for that to happen. And scaling in this case is really about taking the opportunity to also challenge what are the goals that we have. It's clear that we want to decarbonize. It's clear where we want to go. Regulations such as globally thinking about really concrete steps on carbon pricing. Why is it so hard for us to get to the point that by establishing the right level of carbon pricing, we would be able to accelerate many of these investments and shifting those investments from fossil into renewables? It takes everyone to contribute to get there.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and maybe sort of a bit of a plug, but I mean, last week with the World Economic Forum, we had over 91 CEOs who signed an open letter exactly to make some of these points, right? Yes, we need business leadership. All of these CEOs have set decarbonization targets that are Paris aligned, but also we can do more if we do it in partnership, of course, in partnerships with governments to help facilitate the establishment of carbon prices as a scaling mechanism, probably faster than any other. We can't wait necessarily, though, for those types of solutions to come to bear. We need to keep pushing for it, but we need to keep driving these investments in the meantime, while also hoping that we can really drive some of those carbon pricing mechanisms that, if in place, as you say, will accelerate incredibly the investments into some of these solutions as well. So I think it's a very important point. With just, I think, a few minutes left, what I'd love is just to hear maybe just a closing reflection from each of you. We've covered quite a lot of ground, I think, in this discussion, the need for finance, the opportunities, I think, and also the solutions to be able to actually channel investment and finance into emerging markets, the opportunity and the need to scale those types of investments. And I think you talked a lot about trust, partnerships, collaborating with the ecosystem of players to actually do this, but to do this in a way that is very, I think, context conscious. I would frame it like that. We need to be incredibly context conscious when we're talking about driving these investments. I can say I've lived in the ASEAN region, and a technology solution that works in Switzerland, where I am from, is not the technology solution that works in Bhutan, where I lived for a number of years. And I think we need to be very, and you talked to this, Claudio, conscious that actually there needs to be a partnership between those designing and thinking through the application of solutions in markets to make sure that those investments don't effectively become obsolete for lack of context consciousness when they're actually being implemented as well. So I think there's another dimension that we need to just keep in our minds, front and center in our minds, so that we're making the right decisions with the right solutions as well, and recognize that actually there's incredible homegrown solutions in these emerging markets and between emerging markets as well that are hugely, it's a huge source of growth as well from these economies. So this global partnership, I think, is critical. It's not just about sort of positioning solutions into markets, but partnering between providers and those that are actually using them to help ensure that these solutions play a long-term role, I think, in the transition as well. So with that, I think maybe just, a few closing words. Minister, maybe if I could start with you. What is your message kind of out of this conversation on scaling investment to help you achieve your renewable energy transition?
Yeah. From this COP26 forum, we saw the enthusiasm of the people to combat the climate change, and then the willingness to work together from the technology community, financial community, also the government. So let's get together and then work together to achieve the global target.
It's a great word to close on. We have to do this together. Anna, over to you.
I would thoroughly agree with the Minister, of course, because this has to be collaborative. I mean, this whole meeting is about really fully understanding that we all need to be contributing in our own way. And I think what we particularly need to look at, I think the financial community as such is quite conservative, especially when it comes to risk assessment. But in terms of really ensuring that we have the context that you have outlined, which is very important, each market to its own in a way, I think we need to also be possibly a little bit more courageous when it comes to not risk assessment necessarily, but risk mitigation, because you really need to think about each market and their specific needs and how do you mitigate some of the risks that may be there from a financial point of view. So collaboration and courage.
Thank you. Claudio?
Well, all well said. I would just add, I think to close on a positive note, technology is not an issue. Financing is not an issue. How do we move now from, and by the way, planning, concrete plans, we see more and more of those. Good example from Indonesia, as we just mentioned. So how do we now move into, from the planning into execution, into implementing, and hopefully we all understand that we don't have much time as we heard. So I think the soft part, which is the trust and the collaboration, is the one that we need to address. But I think we are in a good place to start. Now we need to execute.
Super. No, thank you. Thank you for those closing, I think, both positive but also challenging words to us all to be able to kind of drive solutions in this space, but also scale and work quickly. So with that, I think sort of turning back to our global audience, I'd like to thank our panelists for an incredibly rich discussion. I think we hopefully have sort of taken the dialogue forward here as well. And I think equally to your point, Claudio, about some of the frameworks that are being developed as solutions in order to drive this forward. As I mentioned at the top, the World Economic Forum in collaboration with Hitachi Energy and a number of others is looking to be able to create some of these specific roadmaps and collaborate in particular markets to look at how we can actually start to mobilize more investment in clean energy solutions through this initiative and very much welcome global partners to work with us. As you say, this requires a global partnership. It requires collaboration with finance mechanisms, with the technology providers, and in particular with the governments to, one, create these roadmaps, but also then to deploy the capital behind them that we need and quickly enough. So with that, thank you again to our panel. Thank you to the viewers in the audience here at COP26, but also watching live, and we look forward to hopefully collaborating with many of you to really driving the objectives that we have here at COP. One, tackling climate change, but in particular driving more funding and finance and investment into renewable energy energy transition solutions in emerging markets. As we said at the beginning, we need a 7-fold increase in a very short amount of time, so we have to work together to make this happen. So thank you very much.